I'm Renee, and I want to welcome you to the craft table. Today I'm going to be talking about a temperature quilt. These are the first 4 blocks of my temperature quilt so far. If you're not familiar with what a temperature quilt is, I highly recommend that you search that hashtag on Instagram. You will be so inspired by the variety of blocks and quilts that you will find in that hashtag. Briefly, a temperature quilt is made up of blocks. They represents the temperature of each day of the year. There is no one pattern on how to make a temperature quilt. I'm keeping my blocks super easy, super scrappy, super simple, with my favorite combination of low volume fabrics and bright colors. And I'm only going to be recording the high temperature. So each block will be a 4 patch of low volume fabrics where the high temperature is recorded by the circle. And I'm making the circles using the Applipops. So this is how I'm doing my temperature quilt. This is my key that I have here. I'm going really scrappy, and I'm not really worrying too much about, actually I'm not worrying at all about the low temperature. I'm only going to be recording the high temperature. So being in Florida, I think I'm safe just starting from 30 degrees to 100 degrees, and I'm just going to do every 10 degrees, starting at 30 and going up to 100. So I've got red for 30, for high temperatures in the 30s, orange for temperatures in the 40s, yellow for 50s, green for 60s. I split the blues. I've got teal for 70s, navy for the 80s, and then I have purple for the 90s and pink for when we go over 100. Now we do spend some time in Montana in the winter. With it being COVID, that may not be something that we're doing this year. So that's why I didn't even really bother. If it gets below 30, I kind of have a plan B, what I'm going to do with that. So these are what my blocks look like. They're 4 patch, low volume, with a circle representing the high temperature. I'm using the Applipops, the assembly line set with 2-inch circles to make my circles. 2021 has 365 days. So I'm doing my layout 18 blocks by 21 blocks. So that gives me 378 blocks. So I'm going to have 13 extra blocks. So I have a plan on doing a special block to separate each month. So between January and December, that's 11 blocks. And then if I do one at the beginning and one at the end, then that'll get me to my 378 blocks. Each square finishes at 4 inches. So my quilt will end up being 72 inches by 84 inches. So to make things easy, I'm cutting all of my squares 3 inches. And I'm making my circles using the 2-inch Applipops. And I've got another video that goes into depth on how to make the circles if you're interested in that. So 3-inch square works really well for a 2-inch circle. And then I'm making 4 patches of 3-inch low volume squares. And make sure you press your seams open so that when you stitch them together, the seams lie nicely flat, and then you don't have to worry about when you're piecing them which way you're going to position your squares. So then I take a circle and I center it. I just eyeball it. You can fold your circles in quarters to find the center, but I really don't want to mess up my circles once they're done. So I just eyeball the center, and then I'll take a small ruler after I've penned it. I take small applique pens and pin the circle onto my 4 patch. And then I just take a ruler and just make sure that the 1-inch center is lined up with the seam in both directions. And you can use the machine to applique your circles onto your background, but I like to hand applique mine. And usually what I do is I have a stack. I'll do them in batches. I'll have a stack of 4 patches and a stack of circles. And then I've got my notebook where I've been keeping track of the high temperatures each day. And then when I, in between other projects, I'll stitch up a couple in between. So that's how I like to work. So I usually use an applique needle or a milliner's needle, and I use Aurifil 80 weight thread. And then I like to run my thread through this So Fine thread gloss. It really helps to avoid tangles in my thread. And then I hand stitch the circle onto my 4 patch. Now you might wonder why I'm using 4 3-inch squares to make my 4 patch for a 4.5-inch unfinished block. Well, when I'm done appliquing my circle, I will trim my block down. And the reason why I did that is it's just easier when I'm cutting. I know everything is 3 inches. If I were to make it exact, then I'd have to cut them 2 3/4. And then sometimes when you're appliquing onto something onto your background, there'll be a little bit of shrinkage with your block. So that's another reason why I just have them oversized, just a little bit, and then I'll trim them down. So I'm going to give it a good press. Using my ruler, I'm going to trim it to 4.5 inches. But I need to be careful that I trim it equally on all sides. I've got my ruler and I'm lining up the 2 1/4 inch line with the center seam. And I'm trimming off that first edge. I'm going to turn it, again lining up my 2 1/4 inch line on my ruler with the center seam. I'm going to trim that. And then at this point, I should be able to line up those 2 corners that those 2 sides that I've already trimmed with 4.5 on the left, 4.5 on the bottom. And then my center seam should still be 2 1/4. And then I'm going to trim those 2 sides. And there's a block. I have another video tutorial that goes over the techniques of making these circles with the Applipops, and I'll include a link to that video if you're interested in making them the way that I did. But what I like about my plan for this temperature quilt is I can make up circles ahead of time and have a bunch of 4 patches made up ahead of time. And each day, after I've figured out what the high temperature is for that day, I can take whichever circle I need, pin it on one of my background squares, and applique it on. In my bullet journal, on each monthly page, I write down the high temperature. So if I get behind, it's also easy to just catch up by having 4 patches already sewn together and having circles already prepped. It's pretty quick work to hand applique each circle on. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful and that I've motivated you to make a temperature quilt of your own. In the description below, I've included a link to a blog post that goes over all the things that I've talked about in this tutorial, including the size of the blocks that I used, the layout for my quilt, and a link to the tutorial for making the Applipops circles. So please hit the like button and leave me a comment and let me know how you're going to be making your own temperature quilt. Happy stitching!